Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you're a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. And now for our interview with Twig Wheeler. Twig is a trauma specialist, environmentalist, performance artist, applied human ecologist, consultant, educator, and so much more. Twig began training as a somatic therapist in 2002 at the Hartwood School of Massage and joined the Somatic Experiencing community in 2004. As a practitioner, Twig works with individuals, groups, and helping care professionals. Please enjoy this conversation with Twig Wheeler and Brad Kammer.
All right, well, here I am with Twig. Thank you so much, Twig, for being with me.
Real pleasure, Brad. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, what a cool opportunity. I mean, Twig and I are old friends, and so what a cool opportunity. We haven't caught up in a long time.
Too long.
And so this is a little bit of an excuse for us to catch up and also just to share how an amazing person you are and all the great work you're doing in the world that I really want to share with our community. So thanks for being on here.
Well, it's a real pleasure. I'm a real fan of your community and great to connect.
One of the things I thought before I would ask you to introduce yourself, I just have a funny little story as I was preparing for our talk today about like when we first met. I think I had just moved to California, so almost 20 years ago now. And we had a mutual teacher that we kind of knew. And I remember him telling me, oh, you're going to look forward to meeting Twig. And I said, what's a twig? And he said, oh, it's this really cool guy. And then I remember meeting you and just being so struck from the very beginning about your creativity. Like you really stood apart from so many of our colleagues because of the creativity, but particularly because of your mission to kind of make this work much more accessible. And I think that's partly where we bonded it early on, and about both of us, that was a shared passion. And you did it in some really creative ways that I hope you'll be able to share with us and also to see what you're doing now. But yeah, so I'd love for you to share about who you are. And
yeah, well, Brad, that gets me to a story though.
Yeah.
Of when we first met, and I was in school and I was working on a thesis on the kind of the origins of trauma in human societies. And then as I was doing my research, I came across a master thesis on similar themes. And I'm like reading through this thing and I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's already done. This guy already wrote my thesis. And I'm going through and finally I kind of come to terms and realize, wow, this is amazing. And I maybe don't have to write this. And then I learned it was you.
That's great.
It's so great. And so from my heart, just from the very beginning, you've always just been intellectually and emotionally like very tied to my feelings about things. So it's very nice to get to be with you.
We've had some amazing conversations about this. So I'm, again, looking forward to seeing what emerges here. So maybe you can just share with our listeners like who you are, your background, how you got into the trauma field, and yeah, a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I got into the trauma field as a body worker. That was my route in. I was very much interested in the conflicts in society and in history. And I'd been doing, I would say, independent consideration and research on those kind of themes for a long time, largely looking kind of through various historical lenses, capital, labor, these kinds of things. And eventually, I was working downhill as a carpenter from a massage school. And I was in a lot of pain as a carpenter. I thought that that was the reason I was in a lot of pain. and I started going to massage school and started to get very interested in the nervous system there. And I started to think, oh, maybe my historical analysis of what's gone wrong, has it always been like this? Maybe it's missing a major component of what's going on for the creature, the critter, the species that's involved in all of this. And one thing led to the next, and in that massage school, I was introduced to Peter Levine's work, Somatic Experiencing, and in reading his book, really answered a lot of questions that I was actively seeking about the nervous system's influence on behavior and how it can definitively challenge the opportunities for change, even when you know that you should kind of be doing differently. And so that led me into the SE training. And as I said, I didn't go home for a while, maybe about 10 years. I kind of got on the somatic experiencing path and became an assistant and a bit of an understudy to the work, and then a promoter of the work and an advocate of the work, and been floating around in that community ever since 2004. And knew from the start that I wasn't really destined to be a clinician. I really kind of developed clinical skills, but my felt sense task was communication. I think that takes it back to that pain that I was in as a carpenter. It was actually just my own PTSD. Like, of course you're in pain if you're working like 70 hours a week doing heavy construction. Like, why are you doing 70 hours a week of heavy construction kind of thing? You know, but as I got into the work and realized it wasn't just this historical other perspective that I was looking for, it was also a perspective on my own circumstances. And so that led me into therapy, and really exceptional help from very good therapy. And so I always considered myself more of a client in a way than a therapist. And so part of my advocacy or communications about the work has been trying to translate it out into the world as best I can. And part of that comes to working with clinicians, and I still do that, kind of teaching or do workshops and do a lot of consultation for SE practitioners. But then I think my major passion is trying to find other avenues through which to explain and share the work with folks that don't know that there's good reason for why they feel the way they do, and how they could feel so much better if they had some guidance on how to do so.
Yeah. I also know that you have a background in nature-based healing and nature-based community work. And this term that you use, or you used to use, I'm not sure if you still do, about being a cultural animator.
Yes.
Could you fit that piece in and help define what that even means?
Sure. I'm really grateful for this, because I knew I didn't want to be a professional therapist per se, and I knew I didn't want to be a teacher of any single modality and focus in on clinical work. So I was already doing outreach things, performances, storytelling, as best I could, zany little things to grab the attention and explain the autonomic stress response and polyvagal theory and those kind of things. And in 2008, I had the opportunity to go over to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was working with a grassroots movement over there. I got invited to go work with them. And they had a whole cultural practice there in these really war-affected areas that were trying to reconstitute their communities. They had this practice of these cultural animators. And that's who I went to go work with. And I did my best to share these kind of nervous system issues and examples and processes with folks there within this group of cultural animators. And their status is very interesting to me, because they were kind of like considered lay people, meaning that they weren't specialists. So they weren't the priests, they weren't the doctors, although some of them were formerly doctors, but they were people of the community who had taken particular interest in the challenges facing the community. And they had gone and learned enough about the issues that they could come back and be a kind of animating force to the community in solving their own problems, rather than looking for expert solutions from outside of their local system. And in working with them in 2008, and I went back in 2009, just a month each time, but then worked closely at a distance, and really took on this appreciation of the kind of community member who isn't exactly the elite specialist, which is kind of just maybe my own autonomy thing, kind of prescribing me from not being able to do that. It kind of gave this other place to be like, well, yeah, but you can be this kind of animator or motivator of considerations of like both the challenges that the community might face, but then also the solutions that are here if we turn our attention to them. So in working with them, they gave me that phrase. They said, oh, you do that too. And I said, oh, I'm going to take that.
How do we put that into some kind of box to help people in the West or in the United States understand? Are there people that are doing similar things to that?
Well, it is a kind of position or title in what they call the Global South. So in areas of South America and Africa, India, there's a kind of psychosocial accompaniment model in those places that are kind of training up, not therapists, not counselors, not politicians, not in all of those specialties, but they're training up the capacity to, frankly, be inside of the challenge and be inside of the tension of not having the answer, but they are more or less trained to try to likely add information to the community, but then also stimulate the community's access to their own inherent positive resources. So as an example, and this was just amazing, I was really gifted an opportunity to work with Tas Mukwa in Democratic Republic of Congo, he really animated this whole grassroots movement in Eastern DRC when I was there. And Tas had, and he trained people to do this, he had this capacity to step out into a village meeting of 200 people who hadn't seen visitors for a long time. It's a very big deal. Everybody comes together, and mostly to share their grievances, of which there are countless in a way.
Yeah.
And Tas could stand in the middle of this kind of onslaught of like, what are you going to do? You're from away. You must be the expert. How are you going to fix our problems? Which is kind of a typical pattern. And Tas could turn that around to say, who else is having this problem? And then since this was a big deal meeting, people were coming from days walk away to come to these kind of things. And somebody would say, well, we were dealing with that. And somebody else, well, we're dealing with that. And then he'd say, well, who's dealing with it and found some kind of solution? And now they're, oh, well, we did this, we did that. And now he's in the role of kind of translating the solution or pulling the solution in a local way out from the group. I think we have a lot of folks who do things like that in North America. Generally, I think we call them activists generally. But this particular quality of both sharing information, but not necessarily guiding exactly what's to happen, but instead to call out the positive resources of the community. That's something I aspire to. Unfortunately, I don't know if I always get there, but that's the notion.
And that's another part of your background of being part of activist movements in the past. And I guess I was just thinking as you were talking about, like, you have your foot in many different worlds, and how do all those different parts of your experience or parts of your identity fit into really what your passion is and what you're doing in the world?
It's been like kind of a through and through process. I do think my PTSD earlier in life, which I think deeply resolved now, but it really set me up for kind of judging my behavior and judging my participation in the world kind of excessively. So, if I get in my car, I'm thinking about its impact on the planet, and that's not an easy way to live. But then at the same time, if I'm doing a project, it has to have some kind of purpose. Haven't yet been able to do like a kind of capital-oriented project.
So I want to pause because I know there's so many great things that you're probably doing that I want to get to a little bit later, but maybe we can just kind of reverse a little bit in terms of one of the things that we're kind of doing a lot of advocacy and promotion through Transforming Trauma is just kind of getting a sense of how different people that are in the field relate to this idea of complex trauma. And, you've been in this field for a long time now. And how do you talk about complex trauma? What does it mean to you? And how do you share that through your performances or through your teaching and consulting?
That's great. It kind of like plays itself out. I will admit that I do a certain kind of thing with my performative aspects. I mean, it's kind of the reason I'm not currently a clinician, because I'm trying to get looser with my language. So in trying to be more colloquial, I'm often relating more to the experience of it than what I've been well trained in terms of like various phrases and such. And with professionals, I think part of the reason people like my work is that I have this I trained myself to do this little tendency to go into the professional language and then pick up on it and then move it back over to some kind of colloquial thing, thinking to myself, like, well, everybody else in the audience is in this, like, as people too. So tends to kind of resonate. So in that way, you know, when I'm working or talking colloquial with people, like I'm generally talking about like just how screwy it is that we always feel so screwed up when such and such and such and such happens, you know. But then, you know, if I may take a moment, because you've been mentioning like, what are you up to now? And I know what I'm up to next, and that is that I'm going to be busking in 2023. So I've been studying busking, street performance, and I have this show that I've been working on, What If Everybody Knew? And I've done that in various different venues, and it's mostly around like, what if everybody understood and appreciated the stress response as like the discrete experience of this trauma reaction. And I've been kind of molding it to doing it on the street, and I kind of did some study over in the UK this year and kind of preparing myself to do that. But I'm aware that I can't start anything new until I finish cleaning up. I think it's the last couple months now, but it's been a big process, cleaning up this tremendous amount of chaos that has kind of continued in my life. That is a pure setup from when I really had like distinct complex PTSD. So, and I mean everything from like how my life manages its mail, like how my mail comes in, you know, like my belongings, but like my residence. Like when I started therapy, I was living on the road because I didn't want to be known where I was. And I would call my therapist from a payphone. I was pretty distressed. So I was kind of like never tied down, you know, and it's been a real process of being seen, being known, choosing an address that's known. You know, my home in the mountains was kind of at the end of the road, kind of a hidden kind of thing. And so the last 4 years, I was remodeling my home, my house that I had made. It was a kind of passive solar handmade thing.
Beautiful place.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I built that in my 20s when I really had PTSD. Like I know that now, and everybody can see it now. And now I'm coming back in my 40s, and we've long since, the person I built it with, we've long since divorced. We've been kind of keeping this very special hand-built thing between us. It's time to let that go. It needs repairs. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to remodel it, make it all wonderful, make it available for somebody else to make their home here. I started on that. I had no idea how long it would take. And then, wow, what a process, because here are physical representations of my previous chaos. A problem with the roof. I know I need to fix that problem with the roof. When I did it, it wasn't perfect. So here I go to fix that problem. Oh, it's become a major problem over the years. Whether it's in the woods, it's like a thing that deteriorates without it being either very well done at the beginning, very well organized at the beginning, or maintained well. And all of which had gone to the side when I was traveling so much with SE. So here I am fixing things, and on a weekly basis, I would take on the electrical system, and the wires are going every which way, you know, and here I am, I'm just like doing it the way that I do it now. And at the end, it's like, oh my gosh, it's like, well, when the inspector came, he took off the electrical panel, and he looks at it, and he turns to me, and he says, "Did you do this?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I did that." And he's like, "You did a good job." If you'd seen in fact, there are pictures, you know, before and after.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable, the before and after.
God, it's literally rewiring the system.
Literally rewiring the system.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Absolutely. And it's been, I had that physical process, and then I've kind of moved off the mountain. My house sold. People are doing great there. And in doing that, it's just like, okay, well, how am I going to live now? And so before taking on any new projects, I've really kind of given myself a year now since moving from there to make sure that I don't reproduce this kind of chaos again. Yeah, and then that kind of leads to a thing that I often think about complex PTSD, because a lot of us, and I am in this, you know, it's like, oh, I found out that I'm kind of really disorganized inside, and the world really is a challenging place on its own, but then I really am buffeted by it altogether all the more. And so, oh, I'm going to get some help, and it's great. We have so much great help these days. Really, it's so great. And then it's like you could kind of hope that I'm going to do some therapy and then everything's going to be like the way I want it to be. And yet everybody from your life knows you as the person from before.
Mm-hmm.
All of your background tendencies of how you've been organizing your physicality in the world, or organized from when things were chaotic or when things were kind of less managed, well managed. And it's a long continuum, and I keep being amazed by how long a process, a delightful process once you realize, like, I'm in the right direction, this is still work, but it's better off than when I was just really drowning. But it's amazing how it's not just like, oh, I feel better and now everything's okay. It's like, oh, I feel better and now I have to kind of deal with the accumulated consequences of the challenges from before.
Yeah. We shared many times together in the SE community, and several times we were together at Esalen Institute and watching Peter Levine just do this magical work for people that would travel from all around the world to come there. And he is a powerful healer, and he would do these incredible sessions. And then I would think about, like, what happens to these people after? And now what's happening with all the plant medicine and psychedelic medicine, you're hearing the same situation. It's like people are having these incredibly life transformative experiences, but how are they able to actually bring them and integrate them into their life? And there's a lot of people being challenged by that. And so I'm hearing there's something about that process for you.
When I learned about titration, I said, okay, I'll do titration, but I'm going to be on the knife's edge of titration. It's going to be like the biggest deal that I can handle then, rather than, that was my argument, I don't subscribe to almost any of that now. It's just like, oh, it's so much needs to be able to integrate with your daily life. And, that's one of the reasons that, like, earth-based studies and experimental archaeology and, like, ancestral living skills, as we tend to call it now, it's like that is a very big part of my life, of trying to make sure I'm doing stuff in the daily round that my ancestors did. I don't do that every day when I'm in computer land, but I'm definitely, like, coming back to that on the regular, chopping wood at the least. And the physicality of these things, the daily round of these things, they really matter in terms of regulating my system in general. But then, like, they kind of, like, remind me that, like, big experiences have to just be able to come down to life basics. And so our capacity for translating big changes, I think it can be there, and I certainly am a fan of altered states and exploratory states, and kind of advocate for people's right to do such things. But I definitely don't believe that that integrates as easily as people think or want it to. And that part of the problem then is the mismatch of expectations, that they thought that they would have this powerful session, this 1 or 3 session kind of thing with a powerful healer or with a plant medicine and such, and then they'll go home, and with that wonderful changed feeling, it will stay, it will influence everything else, the rest of the world will see it. And when it doesn't, and their neighbor still sees them as the same kind of person, expects them to be, then there's this, like, oh, this is so not right. This daily life thing is terrible. And it's just like, well, that's totally understandable. But the mismatch of those expectations makes it so you don't get to have the goodness of the kind of out there kind of thing, or, like, kind of relate to, oh yeah, and I still got to do the daily work of, like, helping things be more, I don't mean to be boring, I'm not saying boring, but definitely more regulated.
Yeah. You mentioned just kind of some, like, embodiment practices. I'm sure they wouldn't necessarily be called that, but, like, just chopping wood or doing things that are connecting you to a certain kind of regulation. Are there other things that you use for yourself on a daily basis that helps you to, to help the integration from some of these big experiences that you've had and are doing?
Well, I listen to the news every day, and that gets me going in a big way every day. And so I find myself doing some kind of thing to chill myself out every day. So 3 things to say. One is that over the years, I've definitely integrated all of the practical activities in SC and different somatic things. So I'm constantly doing something to kind of, like, have my system roll through an activation cycle. Like, I'm using Peter's VU sound. I'm kind of squeezing something and letting go of it. I'm, like, moving as I massage my jaw a lot, thinking about
Mhm.
polyvagal kind of stuff. I orient,
Mhm.
I consult for SE practitioners, and so I'm regularly hearing the heavy that they're working with. And it sometimes comes unfiltered because they want to tell me everything that's happened to their client to express to me how bad it is for
Mhm.
them and how hard it is
Mhm.
as a clinician to figure out what to do. And I totally appreciate that. But then as it comes at me, I'm getting all my reaction up. I remember working on this for a time, but now I'm just like, as I hear it coming on, I'm like taking a deeper breath and I'm extending my exhalation as I'm listening.
Mm.
Like from a polyvagal perspective, I'm giving more time for the vagal break to slow things down. And I'm attentive, but I'm also giving myself permission to orient while I'm hearing these things. And I can't believe how helpful all of that is.
Mhm.
And then, yes, I have a thing about maintaining regular practices with our physicality, with our body, with our species kind of things,
Mhm.
and the daily round in some way. Like, if it's just thinking about it, that's fine. But if it's just looking off at the skyline, that could be if I'm in the Houston airport or something, you know. But then, you know, if I'm in the Houston airport, I'm doing other interesting things, either moving. I like to dance and
Mm.
when I'm traveling, or I'm trying to do social engagement with people. So I have a tendency to look for the person that I can engage with and start some kind of conversation to get some social engagement thing, which is one of the most ancestral of our skills for sure.
Well, thanks for sharing all that. It's nice to hear how you've kind of integrated all these different things and what works for you and what supports you. And I also was just thinking this might be a good launching point to this next topic, which is kind of a big one. But you were talking about listening to the news every day or watching the news every day, reading the news. And you and I have both been studiers of intergenerational patterns and nature-based challenges and cultural and environmental trauma. And where are you at with that, all of that now? I mean, I know we've had amazing discussions in the past, but based on your learning over the last 20 years in trauma and your own work, watching what's happening environmentally, culturally,
Mm.
in our world, I'm curious where you're at with all of that now.
I'm sad, I'm sad. I'm enraged still, but fortunately that doesn't kind of get my physicality as much as it used to.
Mm-hmm.
That was really hard. But I'm enraged. I'm oftentimes kind of reminding myself, oh yeah, we said all of this was going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of my great influences is cellist Glendinning,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote My Name is Cellist and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization. Yeah, love her. And
Mm-hmm.
she migrated to Bolivia some 10 years ago, and I've gone to visit her a few times. And she's kind of taken on a whole new life there. She still writes different but similar themes in her own way. And I went down a couple years ago to interview her in a kind of autobiographical long piece. And this is like just in 2016, I was there for a month with her. And she talks very advanced about all of these things. And before I went to see her, I had gone to see her archives at the Labadie collection in Amherst, Michigan. So big deal. I went through all of her kind of activist notes from her life and everything. And I find like all of this stuff from her 20s in Berkeley as the environmental movement and the feminist movement and all these things are going, and she's heavily involved. I'm reading her journal from the time. And I'm like, wow, she was having the same kind of conversations then that, I was having with my folks
Mm-hmm.
as I was an activist in my 20s in the early 90s, mid 90s,
Mm-hmm.
through early 2000s. And then I'm talking with her in 2016. And the thing that I noticed about my language with her is that I was still projective about the future. I would still say things about like global warming in the future, industrial society having major issues and very strong issues with even potential of full-scale social and ecological collapse. And even here, I kind of hesitate. I don't talk these ways in public so often these days. And Chalice, she's been at that for so long. In our interview, she says, why are you talking about it as though it's not already happening? It's like the only reason you see it as something that's not already happening is because you're in North America right now. but it's coming there in the same way that it's already come everywhere else.
Mm.
And it's just a kind of process of being in the midst of such things. And it's kind of a thing I'm constantly going like, oh yeah, this is where we're waking up. We're waking up inside of the consequences of long-term intergenerational trauma and responses with it, as well as dramatic influences on like the sustaining functions of this planet that only increase the stress of everybody. And we don't rise well, you know, under stress if we haven't already kind of gone through the recovery process, which requires a lot of safety, like a lot of safety, to be able to get out of repetitive stress patterns.
Say more on that. What do you mean by that, the safety piece?
Well, you know, I think that that's one of the biggest things for NARM. It's definitely one of the biggest things for SE. Stephen Porges declares like one of our biggest things is the need to signal the neuroception of safety to people in order to help re-regulate their nervous system. And like down to the individual level of that, if you've got a distress past, you need a lot of signal of safety. It can't just come as one kind of, here you go, you're safe for a couple minutes, don't you feel it? Oh, you felt it, now just kind of counteract all the other hard feelings with that. It doesn't work that way. It's like a kind of like learning that it's okay to feel different. And it very much requires the neuroception of safety, sufficient safety, to be able to do so. And this is problematic. I mean, as the world is more and more challenged, the news, the obvious effect is more and more threatening. So it's hard to get a neuroception of safety up that would allow for feeling states to be able to move through rather than just to have the threat signals reproduce the need for more threat response.
Yeah, this is something I think about and talk a lot about. And I'm curious your perspective. It's like, you know, we're in this world where there's so much lack of collective safety. You know, for those of us that do one-on-one work, it's always been confusing a little bit because in some ways, like we're helping people develop more capacity to be safe and regulated and be more in the present reality and all that stuff. And then we're sending them back out into this world that is like, well, we need those strategies to manage all the lack of safety and all of that. So I don't know. I mean, what's your perspective on the one-on work versus the collective reality of what we're working with right now? Do you have a sense of where you're at with that?
Well, I work with this, I mean, in my own mind, and I think about this, and, you know, professionally, I try to keep a pretty positive attitude about what we're all doing. You know,
Yeah.
I really do, and I really believe in what we're doing and such.
Yeah.
In the backside of my thoughts, I will say to myself, but don't imagine that you're then healing the planet right now. Like you're definitely helping people, and that really matters, and any port in a storm is a viable thing. And we are collectively in a storm, and individuals in certain communities have been in the center of this ongoing storm for a very long time. I don't think anybody's really untouched by it, but the various different kind of degrees to which safety or kind of access to resources that reproduce something like safety, or at least don't reproduce ongoing every minute threat, you know, it's so wide and variable. Our one-on-one work matters so much, but then certainly it's like hard to appreciate the degree of challenge, something that I try not to say so much in public yet, but I often think it's like we just don't know how to plumb what we're into. We don't know how to describe the depth of how dangerous our situation is. We've never seen this before. There's never been so many of us before. There's never been so many consequences of what's come from before reproducing itself so quickly. That said, I truly believe in what we do and really look forward to a kind of expansion of, you know, and this kind of is an edgy thing because, you know, you guys, you're really helping clinicians understand incredibly important nuances that come along with complex PTSD or complex trauma, developmental. And if you just kind of get the basics of that, you can still be of good company and good support and of incredible importance to somebody. But as you get deeper into it, it's just like all that nuance matters because there are just like these differences between people of like whether they collapse, whether they rigidify, like, you know, as an example, and to not have awareness of that nuance makes it so you can easily like try to be too helpful and not,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So then it's like there's a desire in me, a deep desire for a broader cultural awareness and acceptance and appreciation, and kind of a renaissance of like appreciation of the felt sense, appreciation of pendulation, appreciation of titration, appreciation of developmental themes, appreciation of attachment, all of that. And of course, as it becomes popular, such things do, their nuance tends to get blunted, and then it's like kind of scary to see what people reproduce.
I'm so glad you brought this up. This is such an important piece because I think both can be true and need to be true. I mean, we both need to get this more out. The information, the terms that people are now, 20 years ago, people at home wouldn't be using language like the freeze response or dissociation or even trauma. And we have so much more of an understanding and acceptance about, what that actually means and how that impacts us all. But I think this other piece is so important that we don't lose sight of, is that we are talking about very complex internal systems that does require nuance, particularly if we're trying to help people to change some of these internal patterns.
Yeah, it's a dynamic.
Because I know on your webpage you have this quote like trying to help people feel their body on this planet to make this change. And like in a practical way, when you're working with clients or working with therapists that are working with people, how do you hold this dynamic about both getting this information out there in the ways that you're so successful at doing, but also not in a way that loses the nuance or the transformative power?
Well, good. So definitely when I'm consulting with clinicians, that's like in a way easy for me because I can go into the nuance, and I don't understand all of the nuances around developmental trauma. I kind of like looked into that and kind of said, okay, great. I'm so glad I know that much and know to refer. And I'll come back over here and specialize more in shock trauma. So that's like somewhere that I feel very comfortable, both discussing the nuance and discussing like the process of bringing somebody who has definitive, discrete challenges around feeling safe in their experience and in their body, how to help bring them into that process where it becomes safe enough to do, which is completely missed by my stage kind of stuff, where I'm like, advocating for feeling your body, because it's just too broad, and somebody's going to go home and have a panic attack because they heard Twig said, pay attention to your body, and so like I'm often confounded by this, and I find relief in getting to talk professionally with people who are like having the opportunity to work discreetly, directly with individuals, kind of like put that nuance into play. I'll admit, when I first started this, I didn't appreciate the nuance, and I longed for just advocacy of the felt sense, of tracking felt sense experience, of completing incomplete self-protective responses. And even then, when I look back at my own thing, I'm like, oh, you were doing all of these things yourself that were just helping these motor patterns, as one example, just reproduce themselves. And it wasn't until you were with therapists who were more nuanced about how much one should pay attention to something like that, rather than just get good at reproducing that same motor sequence with a challenging feeling state with it. And wow, it really feels attractive. And wow, I'm really doing the work. So this becomes like one of my real challenges in public communication around advocating for it, advocating for the general notions, and then also I'm constantly hedging my comments nowadays, and I've been doing that 10 years or so. If I make these declarations, I'm also kind of like trying to find artful ways to say, hey, and look, it's not going to be easy for everybody, and you're one of those people who it's not going to be easy for, and so when you notice, it's not like, well, that didn't feel great, to spend a few moments thinking about something that they call a resource, something that you kind of found some satisfaction and heartfelt like goodness out of. Oh, that led you to like feeling all the bad things. Look, there's help out there. So I kind of try to remind myself not to just give people something to go home and hurt themselves with.
I don't know if you're comfortable sharing, but what elicited you to realize this change and having to go more into the nuance and study with more people? Like, did you have specific experiences or?
Well, I've definitely had some people over the years tell me their kind of story of getting really involved in tracking themselves and such. in a kind of non-guided, kind of, just open the floodgates kind of way, which I don't know if my early work kind of really promoted that just as blankly, but it wasn't as sophisticated at making sure I was keeping sight of the fact that when I was doing that, it was partly exploratory, and also I was just new, and then very quickly was guided into not doing so much of that. But I've worried about it ever since my early work, and the primary place that it comes to is that I do improv performance and storytelling performance around these things, and I practice in myself. I'm chopping wood, I'm practicing, I'm on a bike ride, and I'm just kind of thinking, like, how could you do that? Like, what would you be moving like? What would you be saying like? And such. And as I'm doing that, I'm also kind of watching from the clinical perspective of, like, don't say anything dumb, don't give a loaded weapon, like, and I know too much of that is out there. It's like people are really tracking themselves too much, in my opinion. They're being given deep advocacy for that in certain YouTube platforms and such, that when I look into those, I'm just like, oh no, I just have to really make sure I'm not a part of this. And so it's kind of like worried of that. But part of my thing is not everybody can, nor should everybody have to, nor could everybody be able to access real good therapy.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to give over some kind of communication that says your own body, it can have some real confusing signals that can really feel threatening, but it can't just be an enemy. Like, there is definitive healing waiting to happen. And if we can kind of relate to our experience probably differently than we already are, we can help some of that healing express itself. And so very much like to get people more aware of that, and not just more aware that they could go get good therapy.
Yeah. Well, it brings me back to just your role of being a cultural animator. Like, you've done this deep dive into really understanding all the nuances, but then you're also really trying to bring it back to more of the masses in these different ways that you're doing, which I can imagine is really this balance between how to, like you said before about using colloquial language, for example, like how to do it in a way that people can really relate to it and make it accessible, but also without, stripping away some of the nuance, the specificity.
Yeah.
And maybe that can lead us into, like, what are you creating now? I mean, I'm sure, knowing you're creating stuff. And what are you up to right now?
Okay, well, physically, I'm up to building a little tiny house in a friend's backyard. So
Oh, cool.
Maker kind of role has been part of my life. So I built that house, I sold that house, needed a new place to live. So I've been building this little tiny house, and that's a great little thing. Gets me to work with the material world, and I like that. I have been doing this reorganization with my world, my finances, my kind of belongings, all of that. And as I'm doing that, I'm very much projecting on this next project that I intend to work on. So I'll give you a little sneak peek. So one is that I've been working on this thing for a while. It's called Somatic Explorer. So I guess it'll be somaticexplorer.com.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's like an advocacy for one's right to explore their somatic experience, their somatic states, their somatic expressions and such. A certain amount of guidance on how to do it with these nuances, but then kind of an ongoing projection on, like, oh, and this is how so-and-so does it, and this is how so-and-so does it. But so that's something I like to do and have been preparing it. Anticipate launching that in January 2023. And then in spring 2023, I want to go do this street busking tour thing that I've been working on. What if everybody knew?
Are you going to be doing that in the United States, or are you planning on doing it?
I do plan to do that in the United States, to rent on the West Coast.
Great.
Yes, and hope to see you in Ukiah.
Yeah, me too.
That's great. And then probably hit some like choice places on the East Coast as well. And yes, I've been studying over in the UK with a street busker in the School of Busking over there for a couple of years online, and then I went over for the School of Busking this last May. It's great.
How did this evolve from the performances you used to put on?
Almost the same kind of notion. It's just like, well, here I am in a performance. It's nice to have an audience. All those people had to know about me in order to choose to get a ticket to come to this. And I'm like, okay, so I'm doing my task. I'm like sharing this with more people. as compared to, and bless us all who do the one-on-one work, but like that was a frustration for me doing one-on-one work as this kind of advocate kind of thing. I want more people to be able to share it with. So from there, I was like, well, two things, Brad. One is that inside of this, I am a deep fan of recovering childhood feeling states. And the first memory I can remember of a busker was at Balboa Park in San Diego and being mesmerized by this man juggling. And I thought, he's having more fun. And my whole life I've been taken by buskers and really appreciate so much about their creativity and their kind of forwardness and such. So it's been a kind of thing since I was doing those stage performances that I would want to try to take it to where people weren't already expecting it, but to try to make it interesting enough that I could grab their attention.
Oh, wow, that's cool. It brought up a memory for me. I mean, I was a little older, but in my early 20s when I was traveling, I traveled with this guy who was a fire breather or whatever.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wow. Really? Yeah.
They drank the gasoline, and then, I mean, it was incredible to watch him. And
wow.
I mean, talk about crowds that would form around at night on the streets. And
yes,
he did this whole charismatic presentation. And yeah, those are great memories to think about how those people, you know, you're walking home from a restaurant and you just have this like 30-second interaction and they impact you, you know?
Yes, they impact you. And I'd really like to have people walk away and go like, huh, well, that is something. It's not just that he's right. I mean, that notion is right.
Yeah.
We all know these things. We know these things because we all kind of have these things inside of us. The autonomic stress response is a kind of implicit experience that we all share. We get our little nuances and kind of translations of it, but if you translate that communication to people, people really take to it. It's like, oh yeah, I do feel weird when that kind of thing happens, and those are the kinds of feelings that go on in my body. Oh, those kind of things are trying to help me do something.
Do you have plans for putting this online too, like YouTube, TikTok, all that stuff?
Yeah, okay. If we have to do that, then I'll do it. I'll say I don't plan to do that show forever. I'd like to do the tour and record it and have it be a final piece.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. You know, the last YouTube kind of thing I did was River Minutes. I don't know if you know that project, but in 2020, before the pandemic began, I started filming the Methow River that I was living near, and I really appreciate that valley. And I started filming that river. It took more time than this, but the notion was to share a minute of the river every day. And it was a bit of a devotional project. So I did that every day, and the pandemic started, and I was like, okay, I guess I'll do this. And but George Floyd was murdered, and I was like, oh, am I going to keep doing this? And I continued from there to film, but I stopped publishing. And then a year later, I went and recovered all of the pieces that hadn't been published. So on Instagram and Facebook, there's like River Minutes as a page, and it has a minute from each day somewhere along the Methow River watershed of just the river flowing and the season changing and no dialogue. I've talked so much that I was like, I need to turn toward listening. So I spent that year listening. Yeah. That's also at riverminutes.com too.
So you also have left behind for somatic practitioners tons of amazing resources. So before we wrap up, I want to make sure if you want to kind of promote any of those things or point people to where they might find them. I know the one that, you know, you did one, for example, on working in the aftermath of environmental disasters, particularly fires, I think.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah, that project really should be expanded, but that one is stresslessguide.com. And that is focused on living near and in relationship with ongoing wildfires and natural disasters of that nature. It just is a kind of audio sequence that I did for the radio while my community has several times gone through multi-month fire events. It's kind of talking about psychobiological principles that we can use or appreciate to help downregulate and I think that this is an important categorization of like an ongoing stressor. And like the pandemic was an ongoing stressor, like some communities are just historical ongoing stressors. A lot of folks that I kind of have access to like a certain amount of okayness in their life, they get an ongoing stressor in some kind of family scene, but it's kind of like bumps and then things go steady again. And it feels really different when an ongoing stressor takes place, like a wildfire. And so like how to help your nervous system during those kinds of things, that's in the Stress List Guide. And I think that's the biggest project I've done, and that is SE Reflections. And that is a site that I created for SE practitioners. Mostly other people come to it, but it's directed toward SE practitioners and uses that language. And it's a podcast series that I ran for 100 episodes. And then I have a couple of workshops in there as well. And some interviews that I find really important, like an interview with the late Dr. Robert Scare. Lovely. So that project, SE Reflections, the intention was to be helpful and to give me an exit from repeating those same conversations. So it was kind of material that I find myself sharing with SE practitioners a lot in consultation and in workshops and such. And I really wanted to move over to this colloquial language with the general public. And I didn't want to take that resource away from the world. So I spent many years doing those recordings and developing that website. And I still have a couple more things I'd like to go back and add, but it's mostly kind of an archive to support SE practitioners and to kind of say, I did that, and probably what I have to say is there. It's not entirely true, but probably most of it, and probably go off and do these other things into the future.
Yeah, I just want to make a shout out. I mean, what a valuable resource. I remember, and some of them you did really creatively with like little cartoons and stuff. I remember that you put together and really helping people with languaging and the nuance around languaging and somatic experiencing. And I don't know if you have to be an SE practitioner, but I think anyone that's in the somatic world, it would be super useful to look into those resources.
Oh yeah, a lot of people use it for various different parts of it. And there's a lot of polyvagal stuff there. Like, that's something that I'm a huge fan of, Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory, and think that I grok it and feel like I have a lot of fun translating it. So I've enjoyed kind of playing with it more than just explaining it.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to share just while we got people here listening to us?
You know, it is a kind of a thing for me, Brad, to be joyously with you and to say, like, is the audiobook of your new book coming out like real soon?
Real soon, yeah. By the time this episode is out, it will be out, yes.
That is such great news for me, because as my little builder self works, I'm often listening to Larry Heller and Elaine Lapierre's book just this last week. And so I'm really looking forward to listening to your book while I do my projects.
Yeah, and I just wanted to appreciate how our relationship over the years, and you've been a supporter of me. I know on your podcast you shouted out me a couple times, and I just appreciate us going through this journey together. I mean, watching both of us grow, both professionally and personally, it's been really amazing to be part of this journey with you.
I lose it when I get emails and like there's your picture in some new thing, like you're teaching with SE, you're teaching with NARM, you're like writing the book, you know, it's just like, yes, wonderful. Yeah, wonderful.
We used to have built-in excuses to get together because we were both doing a lot of the SE stuff, and now we've gone in these different directions. But, well, next year, when you're on your busking tour, you definitely...
You got it. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. And for sure, you know, we had a tradition there catching up in December. We missed it a couple times.
That's right.
So I really am grateful that you brought us together today. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's do this again soon. Thank you so much for all the work you've been giving to the world. And I hope this will be an ongoing conversation, because I'm sure lots of people will be interested in learning more about your work. And maybe once you're ready for it, we can even play some pieces on our podcast. And
that'll be fun.
Give people a little feel of you and your work.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Best to you and your family.
Thanks.
All right. And everybody in NARM.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.